Hello everyone, this is Qiong. Welcome to our first session, The World in the 17th Century. Today I want to talk about the climate. The reason I want to mention the climate changes here is because global warming has been neglected by most people in the United States. Droughts, wildfires, floods, storms, and other natural disasters brought by global warming appear to be more often around the world. And in the United States at least, vigilance and preparations for the impact of global warming on our lives are paltry. So how was the weather, the climate in the 17th century world? The world experienced the Little Ice Age. Usually, the Little Ice Age has been conventionally defined as a period extending from the 16th to the 19th centuries. There are several possible causes of the Little Ice Age, including orbital cycles, lower solar activity, and more volcanic activities, etc. So here, this chart shows 400 years of sunspot observations. There is a correlation between low sunspot activity and cooling temperatures. During the period 1645 to 1750, in the middle of the Little Ice Age, there was a period of low solar activity known as the Maunder minimum, which is here. So during this period, people in the Northern Hemisphere, they experienced extreme coldness. So some researchers considered the timing and areas affected by the Little Ice Age suggested largely independent regional climate changes rather than a globally synchronous increased glaciation. At most, there was modest cooling of the Northern Hemisphere during this period. All the civilizations mentioned on our course experienced these natural disasters. If history is any guide, however, these natural disasters may be just the beginning. The Little Ice Age caused a tumultuous and grueling series of revolutions, wars, and famines, which ultimately killed off 1/3 of the human population. Extreme weather caused crop failures, which led to hunger, disease, and forced migrations, which in turn translated to political and social chaos. The prolonged cold, dry periods brought drought upon many communities, resulting in poor crop growth, poor livestock survival, and increased activity of pathogens and disease vectors. Disease tends to intensify under the same conditions that unemployment and economic difficulties arise. Both of these outcomes, disease and unemployment, enhanced each other, generating a lethal positive feedback loop. Although these communities had some contingency plans, such as better crop mixes, emergency grain stocks, and international food trade, these did not always prove to be effective. So here, I'm going to show you a painting drawn during the Little Ice Age. Its name is Ice Skating Near a Village, drawn by a Dutch artist, Hendrik Everkamp. So we can see the Dutch canals and rivers used to freeze over every year during the 17th century, but now they rarely do. So if you want to see a clearer picture, you can find the link here. Okay, so here I show a picture from the Game of Thrones just as a reference. Actually, the nomadic people in the north moved to the south, as we have seen in the Game of Thrones. I'm not comparing the nomadic people to the White Walkers, but it helps you to understand migration from the north to the south when the winter is coming. Communities often lashed out via violent crimes, including robbery and murder. Sexual offenses accusations increased as well, such as adultery, bestiality, and rape. Historians have argued that cultural responses to the consequences of the Little Ice Age consisted of violent scapegoating. Let's take Europe as an example. Europeans sought explanations for the famine, disease, and social unrest that they were experiencing, leading to the act of placing blame upon the innocent. Evidence from several studies indicate that increases in violent actions against marginalized groups that were held responsible for the Little Ice Age overlap with years of particularly cold, dry weather. Now I'm going to give one very example of the violent scapegoating occurring during the Little Ice Age. It was the resurgence of witchcraft trials. This resurgence was brought upon by the climatic decline. Prior to the Little Ice Age, witchcraft was considered as insignificant crime and the victims were rarely accused. But beginning in the 1380s, just as the Little Ice Age began, European populations began to link magic and weather-making. The first systematic witch hunts began in the 1430s, and by the 1480s, it was widely believed that witches should be held accountable for poor weather. Witches were blamed for direct and indirect consequences of the Little Ice Age, for example, livestock epidemics, cows that gave too little milk, little frosts, and unknown diseases. In general, as the temperature dropped, the number of witchcraft trials rose, and the trials decreased when temperature increased. The peaks of witchcraft persecutions overlap with hunger crises that occurred in 1570 and 1580s, the latter lasting a decade. These trials primarily targeted poor women, many of whom were widows. Of course, not everybody agreed that witches should be persecuted for weather-making, but such arguments primarily focused not upon whether witches existed, but upon whether witches had the capability to control the weather. The Catholic Church in the early Middle Ages argued that witches could not control the weather because they were mortals, not gods. But by the mid-13th century, most population agreed with the idea that witches could control natural forces. So here I'm going to show another painting of witchcraft trials. It was painted by Joseph Baker. It was painted in the 19th and the 20th century, but actually it recorded the trials in earlier centuries. Here I'm going to introduce one book, Global Crisis, War, Climate, and Catastrophe in the 17th Century, written by Geoffrey Parker. This book provides more interesting examples of the impact of the Little Ice Age. So this book depicts a global crisis extended from England to Japan and from the Russian Empire to sub-Saharan Africa, North and South America to East Asia society. So here I'm going to talk more about East Asia. East Asia is the most densely populated region on the planet. As the opposite pole of the Euro-Asian landmass, climate-induced crisis was no less, if not more, severe. Even before historians included climate in their accounts, East Asians have noted the 17th century as one of the most turbulent periods in history. If you ask any learned Chinese or Korean national about the period, he or she is likely to give you a list of dances of military conflicts and social unrest, dynastic exchange, famines, epidemics, popular rebellions, and nomadic invasions. So here I'm going to take Korean as an example. Usually, the Korean historical textbook draw a sharp divide between before and after the 1600 to distinguish the early and the late Choson dynasty. So here I'm going to show you more pieces of primary sources in East Asia society. Here is one. Heaven shows warnings and the earth tells us about abnormalities. In this year, we are having a great drought. Barley is not purchased in market anymore, and no seed is planted on earth. So this is from the annals of Choson dynasty in the middle 17th century. Japan also experienced extremely long winter in the late 16th and early 17th century. But Japan invaded Korea in the 17th century. Because of the weather, many Japanese soldiers suffered from unexpected cold weather, which forced them to give up any further military action and retreat. Similar things also happened in China. In North China, this part, Henan province experienced, quote, the worst drought recorded in the last 5 centuries. Now I'm going to show you more records here. All southern provinces suffered from a great famine. Even parents and their children ate each other, and skeletons were everywhere. The bad smell of rotting corpses was spread to even remote areas. Subtropical China reported heavy snowfall in 1640 and 4 to 5 inches of snow and ice in 1642. In the 17th century, a combination of famine, rebellion, and nomadic invasion ensued, followed by a dynastic change from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty. So the Qing Dynasty was founded by the nomadic Manchu people from the northern part of the continent. Now I'm going to end my lecture, but I want to show my attitude about the climate change here. The climate change wrought catastrophe in the early modern world. History should serve as a cautionary tale of the public, as well as for policymakers who shape our future. History may alert the policymakers that, be it global cooling or warming, climate shocks will bring exceptional challenges to state capacity and social welfare. History should also remind us that, unlike during the Little Ice Age, we have and should take ownership of climate change issues. Unlike when decreasing solar and volcanic activity caused the Little Ice Age, today's increasing carbon emission are human-made problems that will ultimately require human-made solutions.